This little train, with its amusing assortment of rolling stock, is typical of branch line Britain just after the war, when the Labour government decided that nationalisation was the way forward. Back in the dark days of 1948, the elderly crew of a little tank engine would commonly find that their locomotive was older than they were. There were 476 different types of steam locomotive in Britain, like the O2 class on the Isle of Wight. The enginemen might be singing for joy on a summer's day, but the country was broke and simply couldn't afford to keep 20,000 steam locomotives of so many different types. Some of them, like this Cardiff dock shunter, were quite literally in a class of their own. They were museum pieces made more expensive by the need to keep spares for each different design. And since the new British Railways empire was so far-flung, with some engines living in country sheds all on their own, the logistics of everyday operation gave no prospect of economy. What was needed, it was thought, 60 years ago, was standardisation of parts and as few classes of engine as possible. Fortunately, there were some modern designs like this Ivet tank engine from the London Midland Railway. It would serve as a blueprint for one of a dozen new standard classes of steam locomotive to be built in the 1950s and 60s. But standardisation meant that some locomotive designs were finished. The Great Western Railway's loading gauge was too wide for the whole of Britain, so its designs couldn't be used nationally. Also working against it was the fact that its engines were right-hand drive, instead of the more usual left-hand drive. And when it came to express passenger locomotives, none of them was suitable for mass production. They all had 3 or 4 cylinders, and for simplicity's sake the new British Railways Board wanted just 2 outside cylinders on its locomotives. So machines like this North Eastern Pacific were rejected as the basis for future designs. At least there was a mixed traffic locomotive waiting in the wings, the LMS Black 5. The Black 5 had a lot going for it, and not just its 2 outside cylinders. The cab, for instance, was an easy place to live for engine men. They all thought the machine was excellent. But British Railways needed more. They needed engines which would run up to 100,000 miles before shopping. And the Black 5s, when fitted with manganese steel liners on the axles, were approaching this magic figure. British Railways had another problem, and that was to preserve morale in each of the 4 railways they'd taken over. The Southern, for instance, had recently produced more than 100 mainline machines, of which it was very proud. But in truth they were temperamental, brilliant in some respects, and a nightmare in others, and quite unsuitable as a mass production template. The man in charge, Robin Riddles, would have to be a diplomat as well as an engineer. It was decided that British Railways would deliberately take good bits of engineering from each region of Britain.
There was a lot of politics in it. He had to keep the various railways happy. he had to allow each of the railways to contribute something into the design. They had to be built at the various railway centres by workshops that might not be used to using the methods that mainly Stanier from Churchwood instituted.
So the standard engines turned out to be the interesting mongrel offspring of all the pedigree breeds.
So you had a boiler which was a Western boiler developed by Stanier. You had on the Pacifics a boiler which was a northeastern boiler but with a bell pair developed by Bullied. You had valve gear largely LNER. You had lubrication from LMS. You had the brake gear from LMS out of Great Western, and so on. So you had a hodgepodge of things which annoyed, of course, the diehards on every region.
The best they could do was find common ground, and this was a design with few enemies. The LMS had built a British record 842 of them. They rarely broke down, and the valve gear was where it could be reached. At first, British Railways flirted with the idea of adding 2 wheels under the cab so they could accommodate a wider firebox. But in the end they came back to the trusty English 460 wheel arrangement that had become the norm for mixed traffic engines. And they struggled to improve the Black Five's cab and, more importantly, its boiler. The shape and proportions of a steam engine's innards had always been a black art. Change a detail, like the blast pipe diameter or the slope of the grate, and you change the locomotive's whole character.
I think the Black 5 is probably one of the best all-round classes of engines, sort of based on the Class 5. This particular engine was built in 1936, but for an engine of that era, it's a very, very modern, very comfortable to drive, fire. It's easy to maintain, everything's on the outside. And you know, it'll do anything you ask of it.
British Railways wanted to retain every ounce of power output when designing an improved Black 5, but there was one hitch. It was hoped to use one wheel size for all the standard classes of big engine, and these 6 feet driving wheels were a bit small for express locomotives. The North Eastern and Southern Railways had found that 6 feet 2 inches was perfect for both express and mixed traffic engines, killing the myth that high speed demanded wheels of up to 7 feet in diameter. These Bullied engines, with their 6 feet 2 inch wheels, were good for 90 miles an hour plus. So when the new standard class 5 engines finally appeared, They had wheels 2 inches taller than the Black 5, a feature amplified by the high-set running boards, which made these engines less aesthetically attractive. By making the cylinders half an inch wider, BR was able to keep power output much the same as on the Black 5s. But to everyone's disappointment, these brand new machines turned out to be drafty and noisy on the footplate.
The cab is a very noisy and cold place. The floor is mostly metal. There's no wood hardly to stand on. So it's noisy because of the metal, and it's cold because of the metal. But they fly. They absolutely fly along when they've got steam. As long as they've got more than 200, they fly along.
Not everyone took to the standard Class 5s, but on, for instance, the North Kent Expresses, they made a name for themselves by working shoulder to shoulder with much bigger engines. Some drivers believed they were good for 100 miles an hour. But what were they like to drive?
Right, well, first of all, the engine is actually mid-gear with the actual steam brake on, the loco steam brake. So the first thing we need to do is actually put it into full forward gear. And we await the guard signal, which we've got, just to warn anybody that may be in the vicinity. Shut the drain cocks, release the actual steam brake, and open the regulator very, very gently.
Here, a standard Class 5 is restarting its 9-coach train on a 1 in 100 gradient and on a curve, which makes slipping more likely.
Just make sure the train's following. And as we begin to move, we can just very slowly bring the reverser back.
The same train at speed with a gradient sharpening from 1 in 100 to 1 in 80. The engine's going well, with a ribbon of steam escaping from the safety valves as evidence of the boiler's good health. But the standard engines were designed for hard coal, and some of the softer grades didn't work so well, a reminder that no design can be good in all circumstances.
They were an engine built for hard coal, and they didn't like soft coal very much. So we had a lot of trouble with them at 9 Elms when they first came out. Hell of a lot of trouble. We couldn't maintain the sort of fire that would keep steam on soft coal. The smoke boxes used to get full up to halfway up the door, and they were supposed to be self-cleaning. But on our coal, they filled up to halfway up the door, because our coal, being Welsh, didn't break up to go through the screens and out the chimney. That was a problem. They were supposed to be self-cleaning smoke boxes. We cleaned our smoke boxes every day. Now, what I discovered was, having ridden on the Great Western, on the kings and castles, I tried firing to them like a king or a castle, with a massive great shovelful of coal, bopping it down about 6 foot into the box, and putting the flap up or shutting the door in between shovelfuls. And I found that worked. And it wasn't the way we were taught to fire on southwestern engines at all, but it worked.
This unusual double-header of a Black 5 and a Standard 5 shows clearly the latter engine's much higher running boards.